So friends, now we will turn our attention inward. Now let us see what was happening in India. We have surveyed them in 200 BC period to to the same AD period. And once you turn your attention to India, then we find that we had some literature, but we can't compare them with the Shiji of you know Simakyan. Why? I will tell you later. We have many traditions. I will delve upon them. I will deal with them. Indian historiography, we give credit to Kalhan as to be the first historian worth the name in Indian history. There were other literature, genre of literature. They also contain parts of history, but Kalhan is outstanding. And although nobody can possibly doubt the presence of elements of history in ancient Indian society, as I was saying, the existence of history as a separate discipline was definitely not there as a subject with the particular methodology. The importance of Kalhan, 1150 AD, when he is writing his Rajtarangini, therefore primarily lies in the fact that it is a major work of history in a society almost unaware of the discipline of history. Kalhan was the son of Champak, who was a minister of Harsha, like we saw in the case of Rimakyan. His father was therefore a major source of his information. He himself carried no official job and expresses itself in boldness and honesty with which he treats the rulers and nobility of his time. Again, there is a bit of, Simakyan's element in this. He carried no personal bitterness against anyone either. His account, unlike Simakyan, his account is dispassionate, wherein there are no heroes, no villains, just individuals with whom he is dealing. Rulers are boldly criticized, as for example, his own contemporary ruler Jasimha. That is his first point of departure, a poetic work without a patron, without heroes. In poetry, always there will be a hero. His second major characteristic is simplicity of language. He is written in Sanskrit, and anybody who has elementary basic knowledge of Sanskrit can read it at ease and can also understand it. He himself says, he notes that his problem is that he has to record so many facts that he can spare no space for literary ornamentation and elusive references. This is the trait of modern historiography. Simakyan also wrote in very simple prose. Defining the basic sentiment, rasa or rasa of his account, he says, it is neither praise nor condemnation, but shantras, resignation, acceptance of one tragedy followed by another. History, therefore, for him is not an arena where great achievements occur, but where great tragedies befall. He describes the sources of his information and the manner in which he claims to have tackled them. He betrays a remarkable sense of critical judgment. He regrets that whereas the earlier annals were not easily available, it was their summaries which were made accessible to the historians. He claims to have gone into the original annals wherever possible. He also claims to have cross-examined the information of these annals. He is not depending on one, cross-check that. He also claims to have cross-examined the information of these annals as far as possible, and from the inscriptions, he also used these inscriptions to fill the gaps. If you remember, when I was talking about my talk on inscriptions, I had told you they are very useful in filling the gaps in our knowledge. This gentleman is doing that. He also refers to the use of coins, numismatics. We have referred to it as a source. For example, he notes the reign of a ruler on the ground of having seen his coins, makes it very clear. He thus also made use of epigraphy to verify the literary evidence. His account is neither a dynastic annals nor panegyric of a particular hero, but is more appropriately a history of a particular region, that is the valley of Kashmir. From around 800 AD, Kalhan becomes rigorously chronological. Each reign is chronologically arranged, though indeed his chronology at times appears erroneous. The succession in which he places events and rulers is very accurate. Kalhan has been criticized by Stan and Keith for believing in myths, fables and witchcraft, and for looking at causal relationships along supernatural lines. Though indeed he mentions these things, once the limitations of writing history in poetry are taken into account, this criticism is not wholly justifiable. I say this in his defense. Kalhan, it seems, was a believer in both the cause and effect. The latter were sometimes, in a manner of mockery, talked about along mythical and religious lines. He makes fun of excellence, role of excellence. His Rajtarangini is often didactic, that is, drawing maxims from particular, that is, for example, those who do cruel deeds shall meet cruel fate. We still say things like that. If you do bad things, bad will come to you. He says, power even corrupts a man. These opinions sometimes do not concur with his own description of events and personalities. Nevertheless, he says this. These are some kinds of, obiter dicta. Kalhan wrote his chronicle of the history of Kashmir, which he entitled the Rajtarangini, in the year 4224 of the Laukika era, which works out to be around 1148-49 AD. He is described as the son of a great Kashmiri minister, the illustrious Lord Champaka in the colophon. It has been suggested that Champak was the minister to King Harsha of Kashmir, who reigned 1089 to 1101 AD. This seems very likely, as it would have given Kalhan the required access to matters, political and bureaucratic, upon which the evidently, bases much of his historical analysis of the medieval history of Kashmir. Had he been a mere litterateur, a man of literature, his analysis may have formed a minor part of the narrative, or may have been omitted altogether, as frequently happened in the writings of some of his near contemporaries. The literary form of the chronicle is, however, that of the Kavya, a poem. This is very peculiar of our Indian literature. Even the texts on scientific themes, scientific treatises, they are mostly written in poetic forms. That creates problem in interpretation. The Rajtarangini is a long narrative poem relating to the history of Kashmir from earliest times to 12th century AD till his time. It is based on traditions, legends, written records and inscriptions. Kalhan explains that he has painstakingly collected popular traditions associated with places of historical interest. He has also consulted major works, and this is the basis of his writing history. He is writing about his sources. He says that he had consulted the works written on the region such as Nilmata Purana, Chemen's Nirpavali, Hel Raja's Parthivavali, and the Chavilla Purana. And of these, the Nilamatta Purana is easily the most important traditional source on the early history of Kashmir. Although, as an accurate historical source, it suffers from the same weaknesses as other Puranic sources. On Purana, I will say separately something. The Mahatmyas were another interesting source, being the handbooks of the family priests at various places of pilgrimage. Vitasta Mahamatya, for example, mentions the important places of pilgrimage along the Vitasta or Jhelum river in Kashmir and relates the historical events as handed down in the tradition connected with these places and people. Kalhan's use of inscriptions as source material is strikingly original. It's original in his historical writing. He refers to inscriptions found in temples, prashastis, eulogies on past kings, the inscriptions referring to grants, mainly of land or revenue. This is very important, on which Marc Bloch has developed his French rural history, made by earlier rulers. The reference to his inscriptions in itself is not what is so important as the fact that he uses information they contain as a legitimate source of information or history. Kalhan was aware of the functions of historical writing, and therefore he declares that his purpose in writing the chronicle is multiple. It is not a single objective, multiple objectives. To try and establish the true chronology and succession of the kings of Kashmir, one. To write a readable narrative on the past, second. And third, to provide a commentary on the past which would lead his readers to reflect on the nature and impermanence of life. In the last of these, we find evidence of his philosophy of history. Kalhan was deeply imbued with the idea of dharma, and for him, historical events were basically the unfolding of the whole system of dharma in its religious, social, and even legal manifestations. It meant not only the adherence to the traditions of religion, but also the upholding of social institutions as prescribed in the Shastras. But unfortunately, Kalhan was not dogmatic on this point, as we shall see later on. The theory of karma evidently also had its own role to play in history. And theory of karma is so intricately, interwoven in our, daily life that is very difficult to get rid of it. The influence of previous births on the present lifetime of a ruler frequently provided a comfortable way out of difficult explanations. It was often used by other contemporary writers as well to account for many actions on the part of kings and statesmen. Linked to the idea of karma was the importance given to the role of fate in human events. Qismat. Kalhan does not resort to the interference of fate all that often, but now and again it comes up. For instance, a number of reasons are given as to why King Harsha of Kashmir finally weakened and lost to his enemies, and the power of the fate is one among these. Associated with the above is the belief in divine retribution, especially in the case of evil kings. This attitude arises in part out of the inability of the people to overthrow a wicked king. But complementary to divine retribution is the divine pleasure, which can be acquired through pious acts of merit, such as generous donations to Brahmanas. The use of witchcraft, particularly as means of revenge, is not excluded amongst the many possible historical explanations of events. Not surprisingly, Kalhan does not hesitate to draw moral lessons from the past. But at the same time, it must be remembered that he was writing in a period of great stress, civil war and political confusion, when it was almost incumbent upon writers to point to the dangers that resulted from similar conditions in the past and warn against them even at the expense of being moralistic or didactic. It was perhaps also the fear of what might happen to the future of Kashmir should the civil war continue that led to a lurking reliance on the supernatural, that something will happen from divine intervention and Kashmir will be saved, this kind of thing. Kalhan's ideas on the writing of history were directly influenced by two main streams of Indian tradition, which were concerned with while recording the past, that is Brahminical and Buddhist traditions. As I said, in the case of that he is depending on various sources, Nilmat Purana and others. Similarly, ideas relating to the Brahminical tradition can be culled from the epics, the Puranas, the historical biographies of the post-Gupta period, such as Banas, Harsha Charita, etc. None of these works indicate a particular sharp consciousness about time. The past extends back in cosmological series of mystical figures. Genealogies are carefully worked out, but the overall concept of placing them accurately in the past in terms of time sequence is absent, is not given the same attention. The historical sections in the Puranas are treated almost as a continuation of the mythological sections. The fact that they are written in the form of prophecy when clearly they refer to events which have happened in the past further detracts from their treatment as events of history. The idea of dharma provided the philosophical and social framework. If the system of varna, ashrama, dharma was observed, then all events were explainable within this system. The emphasis was on the group, the family, the caste, the tribe, etc., not on the individual. In Kalhan, the Buddhist tradition was significantly different. There was clear consciousness about time, which is related to and hinges around the central event of the Buddhist past, that is Mahaparinirvan, which in historical terms is the death of Buddha. The reckoning in the two chronicles of Ceylon, Deepavamsha and Mahavamsha, is based on this event. Although the idea of karma is accepted, the role of the individual's karma to his society is also considered. The past has both moral and social lessons to teach. The fact that Buddhism was an actively proselytizing religion and missionaries were sent to various parts of Asia required the keeping of accurate records of teachers and of missions. These in turn became the basis of much historical thinking and writing. The influence of both these traditions of thinking on the writings of Kalhan can be seen in the gradual change which is noticeable in Rajtarangini. The earlier part of the chronicle is not only based on Brahminical material, but carries the impress of the same historical framework. The first three books are evidently based on semi-historical material, relying heavily on texts such as Nilmata Purana. The fourth book covers the period of Karkota dynasty and brings the narrative up to the about 8th century AD. Clearly here, there was the additional use of the northern Buddhist tradition, since the historical basis of the narrative becomes more marked. There is some evidence on this period of the history of Kashmir available in the annals of Tang dynasty of China. We are told, for instance, that Tohen To Pi Li, believed to be the king Chandrapida, asked for assistance against the Arabs in 713 AD. This is a unique information. Presumably, when Sindh was invaded by the latter and there was a threat to the regions around the upper reaches of the Indus, Kashmir being part of it, if communication with China was so close at this time, and there seems to no good reason to doubt this, then perhaps some trickle of the Chinese emphasis on keeping records and dynastic chronicles may have found its way into the historical traditions of Kashmir. This is our guess. The next three books, 5 to 7, show a marked tendency towards trying to understand the historical events in their context and seeking explanations or other than generally accepted explanations based on dharma, karma, etc. A number of new causative factors are introduced which suggest that the author wished to probe further into the historical past and not merely restrict himself to providing information. The maturity of Kalhan's historical thinking is made evident in the last book of the Rajtarangini, book 8, which is by far the lengthiest and deals with the period preceding his own, a period which obviously he was most familiar with. Not surprisingly, the quality of analysis is significantly different from that in the earlier books. The chronicle takes the reader right back to the beginning of Kashmir, to geological times when the valley of Kashmir was an inland lake. This is very interesting. Finally, it was dredged through the opening of the gorge above the Baramulla, and this, in the traditional sources, is naturally ascribed to a supernatural agency. So, he is accepting that. The earliest kings of Kashmir, such as Gonada first, are associated with the epic heroes and the traditional history as recorded in the Puranas. Thus, Gonada first is related to Jarasandha and plays his part in the various battles of the Mahabharata. This is clearly based on the account in the Nilmata Purana, which would naturally try and link the traditional kings of Kashmir with the traditional history of the major Puranas. Again, Kashmir is brought into the orbit of history of India by reference to the reign of Ashur, the Mauryan emperor, as the ruler of Kashmir. The reference is made to his building stupas and to establishing city of Srinagar. This is clearly based on accounts in Buddhist sources, since the Puranas merely list Ashoka as one of the Mauryan kings and no more. In the earlier books, supernatural causes are given an important role. They are considered important, means accident over narrative. Thus, we are told that famine comes because of the will of the gods, not because of any natural reason. The queen prays to the gods, and slowly the conditions of scarcity recede. Even more fantastic is the story of the resurrection of Sandhimata. He is banished and then imprisoned and put to death by the king. The witches come and put his bones together into a skeleton and revive him, after which he becomes the successor to the king Jayendra. Where, here it is not only the supernatural which is involved, but also the power of the fate, since we are told that, Sandhimata was fated to become king of Kashmir and crushed by an avalanche just when he and the feudal lords were planning an attack on King Harsha, is another example of the interference of the fate. The increasing popularity of Buddhism annoys both the Brahmins and the Nagas, the local cult deities. In order to check this, the Nagas sent down excessive snow at a particular time, which the Brahmins cleverly use against the Buddhists. One of the more curious incidents is related to the fourth book. We are told that the king Lalitaditya was famous for the fact that he collected a number of wise men around him. One of them was the Tukhara, Central Asia, called Shankuna. On a certain occasion, he used a charm on the turbulent waters of a river of Punjab, causing the waters to separate and leave a clear path in the middle for the army to cross this. One wonders whether an echo of the story of Moses and the Red Sea had found the way to Kashmir. Human action, karma, and the merit acquired from this and previous births, punya, are also seen as part of the historical process. A king, no matter how good his intentions, can be thwarted in his work by his own lack of punya or that of his subject. This does not necessarily suggest that the king should therefore be inactive, but rather it is an attempt to explain the obstacles which may beset the working out of the good intention. The 7th and 8th books represent the latter phase of Kalhan's historical thinking. Here the supernatural element and the emphasis on the role of fate are by no means denied, but owing to other causal explanations, they tend to recede somewhat into the background. Historical events are now discussed from many points of view. The personalities involved and their ambitions, weaknesses and power, the emergence of feudatories and their relationship with the king, the role of Damaras and the Brahmins in Kashmir politics, the economic conditions of Kashmir, etc. In writing on the 11th and 12th centuries, Kalhan was writing on his own period and was familiar with the multiple facets that go into the making of an act historical situation. That he recognizes the multiplicity of causes is all that he recognizes the multiplicity of causes is all to his credit. In reflecting on the decline of King Harsha, he mentions that the planets at his birth were ill disposed towards him. So he is believing in Panchang, nothing bad about it, and consequently luck was not on his side. But he adds that Harsha was weak because he avoided battles, and in those conditions, battles were the obvious means of settling many problems. Furthermore, he lacked independent judgment, particularly of men, appointed the wrong kind of persons as ministers, and then relied on their advice. Another source of weakness in a king, which is deplorable, is when he comes under the influence of a scheming woman. Another source of weakness in a king, which is deplorable, is when he comes under the influence of a scheming woman, as if they are the people who forces the king or beguiles the king. King is very innocent. The medieval political history of Kashmir was dominated by two court factions, both of a military nature and Tantrins or Ekangas. In the first half of the 10th century, they made and unmade rulers. Their manipulation of court politics is carefully described. In the succeeding century, the centers of power were no longer only the kings and the ministers, but included a number of Damaras. The word is peculiar to Kashmir and appears to have been a tribal name in origin, but judging by the description of in the Rajtarangini, they appear to have acquired their land through service tenures and gradually made themselves extremely powerful in the fertile parts of the valley. Their social status is apparent by the fact that they acquired wives from among the Rajputs or else often married into the royal family. They believed in matrimonial alliances. They were evidently a serious source of opposition to the king, and the history of Kashmir during this period is full of incidents relating to the Damaras. When discussing administration, Kalhan totally disapproves of the activities of the Kayashthas, to whom he attributes a large share of misfortune of the state because they were holding the revenues of the state. Kayashthas were the scribes and recorders and consequently the backbone of the administration of the state. They were the bureaucrats. The Kayashthas, writes Kalhan, are not only responsible for much of the political intrigue, but even worse. Why? Because according to him, they encourage the kings to oppress their subjects and thus cause disaffection throughout the land. King, Shankar Varman in the 9th century is described as the foremost among fools and sons of slaves for heeding the advice of the Kayashthas. He is so categorically denigrating them. So, who suggests that he plundered the temples and oppressed his subjects in order to extract more money from the land. The Damaras and the Kayashthas between them are bleeding the people dry, according to Kalhan. These are the people responsible, and they were both, important functionaries. Perhaps some of the venom directed against the Kayashthas by Kalhan may have been due to the professional jealousy. Many of the higher positions in the administration were traditionally the preserve of the Brahmins, and possibly the entry of the Kayashthas into their rank, such as collectors of revenue and treasures, was resented by the Brahmins. It must be said to Kalhan's credit that he was also critical, although not equally critical, of the official Brahman organizations such as Purohita Parishads. These were corporate groups, Purohita Parishads, formed by Purohitas attached to certain temples and places of pilgrimage. The group became the joint owner of all the property endowed to the temple and the income from the donations. The members of such parishads were, therefore, very well off materially and very often very powerful politically. Kalhan saw them as another source of interference in the running of the state. Yet his ire against the Purohita Parishads was somewhat softened by his unquestioning acceptance of the theory that a good king must liberally endow the Brahmin community in his land. Agrahara should be given to the Brahmins because that will bring good luck to the king. Kalhan endorsed the role of Brahman as enunciated in traditional political theory at every level. He recognizes as agents of revolt the Tantrins and Ekangas, the Damaras, the royal princes assisted by ministers, the Brahmins. He does not approve of revolts by the first three of these as they are disruptive forces. Yet he accuses when it comes to a reference or references to Brahmins using their traditional weapon against political power, that is fast against a particular king or a minister, on the assumption that fast is always in a righteous cause, the removal of an oppressive king or minister. Early realized that there was a relationship between political power of these various groups, we spoke about, and their economic condition. Passage which runs like a refrain through the second half of the chronicle is that no village should be allowed to stock food in excess of a year's consumption or keep oxen beyond the number of required to till the fields, since the accumulation of wealth leads to the rise of the Damaras in the nature of things, will disobey the king. In addition, he lists as signs of trouble for a king the condition when villages have amenities of towns, when fortifications are not, adequately guarded, when officials start intermarrying and various other similar factors.